And we'll continue with how did the Mongols turn into the Yuan dynasty in China. When we use the word Yuan dynasty, we are referring specifically to the Yuan dynasty in China. So after the death of Genghis Khan, the whole Mongol Empire were divided into four different parts. The Mongols that became the Yuan dynasty is just one part of the Great Khanate that is based now in Beijing. Okay, so let us talk about part A first. How did the Mongols become Chinese? During Genghis Khan, the Mongols ruled a great expanse of territory. Of all the different parts of the Mongol territories, the richest part of this land-based empire is China. And in China, Kublai Khan became the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty. If you look back into history, there are some rewriting of history, and when they write about the first emperor of Yuan dynasty, there are occasions when they try to backdate to a few more emperors to Genghis Khan. But for the sake of clarity, Kublai Khan is the first Yuan dynasty emperor. And for Kublai Khan, he ruled from Beijing. What is important or what is interesting about Kublai Khan is that he tried to transform. We must remember that the Mongols were nomadic tribes, they were tribal, they were from the steppes. But in China, the Mongols could not do the same thing. They could not be the same nomadic tribes. But in China, they had to change their ways. And in China, for the first time, the Mongols had to become a settled population. And when they become a settled population, they had to rely on the Chinese administrators and they had to rule through the native population. But they were not like the Han Dynasty, where they had Chinese Confucian examinations. So the Yuan dynasty relied a lot on foreigners. They particularly favored the Muslims or the Hui Muslims. In China, when we use the word Hui Muslim, we distinctly refer to Chinese Muslim. So Hui Muslims are Chinese Muslims. Hui may not be Chinese Muslims. So the Mongols relied a lot on Chinese Muslims. Okay, and on the same time, something very different happened during the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols converted to Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism became the religion of the Yuan dynasty and of the Mongol ruling dynasty. The Mongols were never interested in Confucian ideology. So they were never ever interested in Confucian scholar examinations. So for the Mongols, they only became partly Chinese. We'll see in 1102, the Mongols, the cousins of the Mongols, the Qings or the Manchus, they were also nomadic tribes, but when they ruled China, they will become even more Chinese than the Chinese. Although they were tribal and they were nomadic, they will adopt Confucianism, then they also adopt Confucian scholars. They will change everything and make themselves even more Chinese than the Han Chinese, but not for the Mongols. In our class today, we'll realize that one part that is very important is Marco Polo. Marco Polo. The name Marco Polo sounds very familiar. If you're in Kuala Lumpur, Marco Polo is one of the most popular restaurants at Wisma Lim Fuyong in Jalan Sultan Ismail. It is probably one of the oldest Chinese restaurants in KL. And if you go there, I'm not too sure, but the last time I was there was perhaps about a year ago. You can see a lot of old people serving. Yeah, the service might not be very good, but the food is very reasonable. Reasonable for expensive food. Anyway, so the name Marco Polo, not the restaurant, but the person from Italy. The travels of Marco Polo. Let's look at Marco Polo. There are a lot of stories about Marco Polo. Firstly, did Marco Polo actually visited Kublai Khan? Did Marco Polo actually made all his way from Venice to the Yuan dynasty? A lot of things that we know about China in the West comes from this book called The Travels of Marco Polo. There are a lot of uncertainties, but yet for this case itself, let us try to say that Marco Polo actually went to China and we know about China through this book. Let us watch this short video clip on Marco Polo.
In the year 1298, at the age of 44, Marco was captured and thrown into a dungeon with a man named Rustichello, a writer of romantic fiction. One can imagine his stunned disbelief when Marco Polo began relating his adventures. Adventures that far exceeded any Rustichello could have concocted himself. For Marco was claiming that before coming back to Italy, he had spent nearly 20 years in China as a personal aide to the mighty Kublai Khan.
I assure you for a fact that before Monsieur Marco had been very long at court, he had mastered 4 languages and their writings. Observing his wisdom, the Khan sent him as an emissary to a country named Karajan, which it took him a good 6 months to reach.
Marco would have Rustichello believe that beginning at age 21, he served for the next 17 years as a special envoy for Kublai Khan, that he was his eyes and ears in the outreaches of China, Tibet, Burma, India, and even as far away as Java.
There is still some lingering controversy as to whether Marco Polo actually reached China. He mentions that he, his father, and his uncle were very important in a major battle that the Mongols undertook against the Song dynasty, against the Chinese. Unfortunately, the battle occurred 3 years before Marco Polo actually reached China, despite these errors and contradictions, because there is so much in the work that's accurate. My own feeling, as I say, is that there's no question that Marco Polo reached China.
Okay, so in this sense, the video says quite clearly that Marco Polo actually reached China. But there are a lot of uncertainties, but that is a story for another different time. Okay, yes, as we look at the Yuan dynasty, it is just one part of the great empire left behind by Genghis Khan. In our previous class on Islam and the expansion of Islam, we have seen that 2 parts of the empire, the Chagatai and the Ilkhanate, both of these empires will eventually become Muslim. Okay, these 2 parts, the Ilkhanate will be somewhat Turkic and Mongol, where they will encounter the Abbasids, and in Chagatai will be where in Uzbekistan, Samarkand, where Dave and Dios, the homeland of these our 2 students and friends. Okay, so the Yuan dynasty is just one part of the successor to Genghis Khan. Now, as much as the Yuan dynasty is very important to the history of China, the legacy of the Yuan dynasty is very important, but the period of the Yuan dynasty is actually very short. In Chinese history, the Yuan dynasty did not even last more than 100 years. It is one of the shortest period of Chinese history. Yet the story and the importance of Yuan dynasty cannot be ignored. Just like when we study on our second class on Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi spent so many years to rule and to unite China as one single kingdom. But his empire was just 221 BC to 216 BC, a misery of just 5 years. So, in this sense, the Yuan was still much better than the Qin dynasty. And the importance of the Yuan is very in the sense that it opens up China to a much wider world. After the death of Kublai Khan, the different segments of the Mongol dynasties, not just the Yuan, the Chagatai, the Russians, and the Ilkhanites, they all went their different ways. Okay, so the Mongols will eventually become Mongols. In Russia, they will just move away, and the whole empire splintered up. In fact, the legacies of the Mongol Empire will live on in very different ways. For example, in order to see the legacies of the Mongols today, you see them in China. Okay, we'll see Mongolians in Mongolia as a sovereign country, as well as Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia is an autonomous region of China. So the legacy of Mongolia, the legacy of the Mongol Empire, perhaps lives on in Mongolia and in Inner Mongolia. In Inner Mongolia, remember one of our first video clips we saw on the commemoration of Genghis Khan. Ordos is also known for a different story altogether. Ordos is the most empty city in the world. A very new city built for 1 million people, but in the early 2000s, it was a ghost city. In 2016, there were probably about 100,000 people in this city. A city made for 1 million people, but just 100,000 people. All of this shows a lot of things of how much additional cash can do. The inner Mongolia is part of China, and in their rush of development of infrastructure, they created a new epic center of culture, economy, and politics. So much money came from coal mining that they were able to build a whole new city in Ordos. But remember our class, we talked about the far reaches of the Mongol Empire. We can see that in today's world, there are still bits and pieces of these Mongol legacies. Yes, in India, we can see that the Mongols become Mongols, but it's very difficult to see them as an individual group. If you ask Dave and Dior, you can also ask them and see if they have any Mongol heritage in their family or in their descendants or their ancestors. But perhaps there is a high chance in Uzbekistan, in Central Asia, that most families will have some form of Mongol heritage. In this last video, I will just show you one part of Mongol that is almost forgotten in Kalmykia. Kalmykia is actually in Europe, very far away from Mongolia. Mongolia is about here. It's about somewhere around here. And this is Kalmykia. Kalmykia is in Europe. And this is perhaps one of the most often cited examples of the furthest extent of the Mongol Empire. And unlike the Chagatai or the Ilkhanate, where it becomes in the Ilkhanate, it becomes after a while becomes very difficult to differentiate who is Mongol and who is Turkic. But in Kalmykia, the Mongol heritage is very clear. Let's look at this short video.
This is the sound of Kalmykia. Throat singing in the steppe or ritual chanting in the temple. I'm attending a ceremony at the Golden Temple of Elista and getting to know a piece of Asia in Europe.
Would you have thought
We were here in Europe, in the steppe, with former nomad people with very exotic songs. Welcome to Kalmykia. I've made my way to the southeasternmost part of Europe. Kalmykia is an autonomous republic of the Russian Federation, located between the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea. The golden abode of Buddha's Shakyamuni is in the capital Elista. It's the most important Buddhist site in the region. Built in 2005, the temple complex with its pagodas, stupas and prayer wheels is the nation's cultural center. Kalmykia is the only Buddhist region in Europe. Some 160,000 Buddhists live here. The statue of Buddha is the highest in Europe. It's 9 meters tall. The Dalai Lama sought out the location of the temple when he was visiting. The Lama Telo Tulku Rinpoche has been the spiritual leader of the Kalmykian Buddhists since 1992.
What we would like to achieve.
Okay, do you notice something? Many things in this video is new. Even the position of the leader is 1992. Look at it. Kalmykia is part of Russia, and Russia used to be Soviet Union. So communism has actually overtaken a lot of the Mongol identity. But after the fall of Soviet Union, the revivalism of the Mongol identity became stronger in Kalmykia. So that's the end for today's class. Let us recap what we have talked about today. We have looked at the Mongols, and we have seen how the Mongols evolved from a nomadic tribe beyond the Great Wall of China, where they pushed into China and became the Yuan dynasty. But at the same time, the Mongols also pushed all the way to Vienna in Austria. Of course, they encountered a lot of hurdles, and they were the largest land-based empire in the world. Next Tuesday, we'll come back and look at the Ming Dynasty as well as the impact of Tibetan Buddhism in China. For now, thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, everyone.